That was lovely. Today's Old Testament lesson is really long, but it's a good one, so I think you guys will enjoy it. The Old Testament lesson is from 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. His spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we might fight together." When Saul and all the Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose in the valley of Elah early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of the Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a cloth of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand into his bag, took out the stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead. He fell face down onto the ground. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. That's the edited version. That story is actually longer in the scripture, and it's a good one, isn't it? We'll get back to the Bible text in a minute. I want to share a story about when I first started working here less than a year ago. So last August, Elizabeth Brandt, Cole and Hannah Ali, Chris Tracy, Anthony Larson, and I, that was the group. We met up here at Manchester UMC, and we drove down to South St. Louis, down to the state streets. And I took Jefferson, I think 44 to Jefferson, and then went south on Jefferson, past Cherokee Street, and then took a right on Winnebago, and was driving up Winnebago, and I saw kind of like boarded up buildings and corner stores with bars on the windows and people of color in the streets. And I knew I was home. I knew I was back in St. Louis. I had just come back from living in Chicago for 3 years. And my husband and I met in that neighborhood. That's where we spent a lot of our time hanging out. And so we pulled up to the corner of Winnebago and Pennsylvania. And I was really, really pregnant at the time. And I was not looking forward to being out in the heat. I was sick every day. It was not pretty. But I was really excited to get to know these young people more. And I was excited to run into my friend Bridget, who we were meeting at the corner of Winnebago and Pennsylvania. And I got out of my car and I was blown away. We were told that we would be going to visit a small community garden. And when I got out of my car, I realized what we were witnessing was a small farm, actually. And I kind of walked through the gates, and I walked up to my friend Bridget, and I wrapped my arms around her, and I was like, "You have been busy. This is amazing." And she started kind of showing us all around, and I got to meet Calvin. Bridget and Calvin are the ones that run this garden. And they look very different. Bridget's a very short white woman with tattoos everywhere. She looks a lot like me, and we're about the same age. And Calvin's an old black man who's like 6'5", and he came up to me with this big smile and put his hand out to shake my hand, and he was like, "Welcome to our little slice of heaven in the middle of the war zone." And it just stuck with me forever. Welcome to our little slice of heaven in the middle of the war zone. And they showed us around, and we spent the afternoon gardening and talking about food justice, talking about food deserts in the St. Louis area, talking about how poverty affects diet and nutrition. We talked about how the stress and the time constraints of the people in the neighborhood had led Bridget and Calvin to taking over the entire garden. We talked about theology around food and what God has to say about the table that we gather at, and what God has to say about how the food that sits on this table gets here, and what resources are spent and used. And it was an amazing afternoon. We talked about stresses and hopelessness of that community, but we also talked about hope and restoring hope, and about how there was hope for the future of the garden, and that there was hope to get more people involved, and to get more people inspired. And Bridget and Calvin shared about how a couple church groups had been down there already, and kind of ways they were getting the community involved, and they were just really grateful that we had come. 3 years before that moment, pretty much what had happened was that garden was owned by the international school in the city, and people from that school would come and grow indigenous food together, food that comes from kind of their homeland. And the project was not well funded and it wasn't well managed and it went to the wayside very quickly. And so a woman in the neighborhood, Gravois Parks, Benton Park kind of area, took it on and said, let's make it a community garden. And so they put boxes in. And that's how Bridget and Calvin got involved with the garden. They knew each other, they were neighbors. They both live in that neighborhood. And every week, they'd come back and look at their box, and someone had abandoned another box. Every single week, this went on and on and on, until by the end of the summer, Bridget and Calvin had taken over essentially every single box in the whole garden, and the woman who ran it was just kind of overwhelmed, and one day she just threw the keys at them and was like, it's your headache now, take it over. And they took the boxes out and they started planting directly in the ground and using the space wisely, and there they were 3 years later. Absolutely inspiring, absolutely inspiring. And at the time that we went down there for this trip, this was just like a one-time, let's go down to the garden. We had no idea that we would end up being in a long-term relational mission with this garden and with Bridget and with Calvin and this community and with the Kingdom House involved, or that like we would be selling produce next week, here at Manchester. None of that was known yet. It turns out that the garden would allow us to be in relationship with other people, right? People who are considered other by society. We knew we wanted to do relational discipleship. We knew we wanted to get to know other people. We wanted to be a part of this new model of mission where it wasn't an us versus them, but we would all be doing something together. We knew that relational discipleship mattered. We knew that doing relational discipleship would lead us to recognizing and dealing with the economic differences and the racial issues, the segregation issues in St. Louis, and the issues of food deserts. And it was a suggestion of one of the young adults, actually Hannah Ali, to get the Kingdom House involved. And here we are now, less than a year later, making a difference and being made different by this experience. And some folks outside of our group thought that going down to the garden and considering doing a long-term relational mission with people of color or people in the city or in a community different than ours was a waste of time. There are poor people in the county too. There's things that need to be done in Manchester. And that's true. That's true. But that same weekend that we went down to that garden that first time, that was the same weekend that Michael Brown was killed on the other side of St. Louis. When I think about the dedication that Bridget and Calvin had to this garden and this neighborhood, I see them making a statement to the world. But to both of them, it was just kind of the natural thing to do, right? In their hearts, they're both gardeners. Maybe this is something you're into. I'm kind of not like a brown thumb kind of person. But, for gardeners, they know how the soil works. They know how to take care of the chickens down at the garden, right? They know how to grow things and to take care of things. And they know what's the weed and what's the plant, Not all of us know those things, right? Some of us need the direction of Bridget and Calvin to show us how those things work, right? And so when this need arose in their neighborhood, this was just a natural thing for them to do. They were like, well, of course, this is our skill set. This is what we do. So they took up this task on a budget of nothing with a paycheck of non-existent. They may be small, but they can do big things. Which brings us back to our story for today. When David confronts Goliath, he brings with him the tools of a shepherd. King Saul thought that David needed the armor of a warrior because that's how you win a battle, right? Saul was unable to think outside of kind of the normal way that things are done. Saul thought David needed the armor and the sword and the helmet. How often do we assume that we need the tools and resources of another person or of another church or of another community to respond to the call that God has put on our lives? All David needed was his shepherding tools. He went with his rod and his slingshot and a bag full of rocks on his hip. Now, it's not to say that David entered the battle equally equipped. That's not true. That's not true at all. No, but that's what makes this story great, right? The stories of David in his youth, just like the one we talked about last week. These are stories about the underdog coming up from behind, right? David didn't have all of the stuff that Goliath had. He didn't have the resources. He didn't have the military know-how. The activists that have gathered in response to the death of Michael Brown, that have pushed for changes to laws in St. Louis, some of which they have done successfully, they were not equally armed, not at all. But they have used the tools that they have, and they have followed the call put upon their lives. When the protests reached the South Grand neighborhood, one of those nights, windows got broken out on South Grand during acts of violence. I have friends that own businesses. I have friends that were cops there. I have friends that were protesters there, every single side. It was just a tragic moment on South Grand. And those same windows got boarded up that night. People stayed up till 3 or 4 in the morning, making sure that the whole neighborhood, that whole strip, had windows, had boards on their windows where they had gotten busted out. And the very next day, members of the South Side community, all different kinds of people, came out and started painting those boards. And they turned them into the coolest pieces of artwork, all up and down South Grand, covered in colors and statements of hope and faith. The tools of the artist are the brush and the creativity. The tools of the activist are dedication and numbers and legislation. And the tools of the gardener are the shovel and the tiller and the seed. David and Goliath, who doesn't know this story, right? In our shortened version from the lectionary, we can kind of start to acknowledge about how well written this piece is. It's actually the most epically written story in the entire Bible. It's the longest, it has the most details. And in this shortened version, there's a couple little points that were left out. So pretty much what's happening is David is running supplies, okay, back and forth between his home, where his father Jesse's home, and this front line where Saul's army is. And it's his job to kind of take like water and food or whatever kind of supplies back and forth. And he overhears the soldiers talking about what happened. And he hears Goliath saying again, here's the challenge I put forward. And the soldiers are talking about what they will get if they actually take on the challenge and win. And David asks one of his older brothers. A few of his older brothers are sitting there serving in Saul's army. And his older brother looks down at him and goes, no, they're not looking for a boy. They're looking for a man. Get out of here. What are you doing here? It's like a perfect older, younger brother story, isn't it? It's so appropriate. I have brothers. I get this. So we might be a little surprised that Saul is willing to even put David on the front line, right? David approaches King Saul, and he's like, I'll go. And Saul's like, you're a child. What are you talking about? And David's like, no. And he does this really amazing, heartfelt speech, right? And Saul can't help but be moved. And so Saul's like, sure, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and put this helmet on you and put this armor on you. We get this whole talk about the armor. And this discussion about armor is interesting on a lot of levels. I mean, we've already kind of talked about how David didn't need that because he has the tools of a shepherd. But I want to talk about the armor of Goliath now. What's interesting is that there is more written about the armor that Goliath wears than about his stature, than about the fact that he's a big guy and that he's strong. And I think that this is a deeply fitting metaphor for systemic issues, as well as the industries that continue to support the evils of those systems. It's not just the size of a corporation or a system that makes them powerful. It is the protections that they have. It is the armor that they wear. Without regulations that require transparency, most systems and organizations, including the church, without regulations that require transparency, most systems and organizations will go unchecked, and that is dangerous. It is a miracle that the Davids of this world have survived the battles with the Goliaths of this world at all. The Goliaths of this world, the racism and the poverty, the corporate interests, the sexism, the homophobia, the heteronormativity, issues surrounding housing and equal pay, the privatization of basic needs, the governments, the military complex, the prison industry of the United States, aka the new Jim Crow, the endless systems that nail Jesus to a cross, that leave a trail of bloody bodies and ruin lives in the name of false gods not worth worshiping, like money and power and greed and dominance. This is who Goliath represents, and these are the gods he brings with him. And if we stoop to his level, and if we wear the same armor and we play the same game, then we too are guilty. Do we believe that bigger is always better? Do we need a Goliath to protect us? Can we trust in a shepherd boy? The Saturday that Michael Brown was killed, the empire won. But the next day in the garden, on that Sunday back in August, a small community said no. And in the days that followed, the community on the north side said no. And then the community on the south side said no. And in the wake of civil unrest, the nonviolence kept its place, and it continues to do so. I mean, let's have some real perspective. The riots were over quickly. There are still people out there doing this work, making a change. They're working for legislative change, and they're not giving up. There are people still working for justice. For the standards of God and the standards of justice are not the standards of our land. And that shepherd boy, he may look small, but he has killed lions and bears and beasts who have attacked his sheep. Make no mistake about it. Today is the 45th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, back in 1969. Some of you were alive when that happened. Some of you may be celebrating down at Pride Fest, which is held at this time because that community is remembering the Stonewall riots. So few establishments welcomed openly gay people in the 1950s and 60s. And the establishments that did were often bars, although bar owners and managers were rarely gay. At the time, the Stonewall Inn was actually owned by the mafia, and it catered to an assortment of patrons and was known to be popular among not just gay folks, but the poorest and most marginalized people in the gay community. Drag queens, representatives of the transgender community, effeminate young men, male prostitutes, and homeless youth. Police raids on gay bars were routine in the 1960s, but officers quickly lost control of the situation at the Stonewall Inn. They attracted a crowd that was incited to a riot. Tensions between the New York City police and gay residents in Greenwich Village erupted into more protests the next evening, and again several nights later. Within weeks, village residents quickly organized into activist groups to concentrate efforts on establishing places for gays and lesbians to be open about their sexual orientation without fear of being arrested. 45 years ago to the day. That was a Goliath that very few thought would be beaten. And look where we are now. We love the story of David and Goliath because we need to. We need to hold on to it and what it teaches us and the lesson that it gives us. G.K. Chesterton reminds us that fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. The Goliaths of this world need Davids to stand up to them. Davids who are willing to confront the power and willing to fight the good fight. And there are many, many ways that you can do this. I believe that the young adult ministry of Manchester United Methodist Church, as well as multiple Sunday school classes, voting themselves into becoming reconciling communities is a step in the right direction for the United Methodist Church. And I pray that we continue to have loving and compassionate and caring conversations about that. But I believe that we are making a difference. I do, and I believe that that Goliath will fall. There are other ways that you can take on these powers that be. There are so many mission opportunities here at Manchester United Methodist Church. If you are curious about a way to get involved with something, send me an email. My email address is on the website, Reverend Winter Hamilton. I will help get you plugged in to something you can do. Or maybe you're called to do something outside of the walls of Manchester with a group of friends, or maybe just as an individual. But I hope that you take the time to pray on that and to think about that. You know, the garden that the young adults are working with, it's just one tiny little small portion. It's one corner of the city that's trying to serve a neighborhood. And that's awesome. But there's a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of corners that need you. Maybe there's a dragon for you to face elsewhere. The point of the story of David and Goliath is not to teach us that there are Goliaths in the world. We know that. The point is to teach us that the Davids can win. Amen. For those of you who are new to our worship service, we like to take time to reflect and pray after the sermon. So we do a type of spiritual formation practice that involves our fingers usually. So I've got a pile of stones, kind of like the ones that David might have had. Who knows, right? So there's 4 Sharpies up here. And if you want to just come up 3 or 4 at a time and to take a stone, if you'd like, and to write a word or maybe draw a picture of something that represents a Goliath in your world that you are trying to take on. You can keep that stone or you can leave it up here on the altar for God. Come forward when you are ready.